And just so you know, was a disclaimer when people signed in, so I won't be going through any long preamble disclaimer, but we'll get going in a minute. No, in a few seconds. Welcome everyone to the Horizon 3 Biotech Investing webinar hosted by Horizon 3 Biotech Fund and sponsored and conducted by FB Rice and Monsoon Communications. This webinar is being recorded, in case you didn't see that, and you've all seen the disclaimer upon registration. Today, we're very fortunate to have two experienced biotech sector executives, Dr. Megan Baldwin, CEO of Opthea, and Danny Sharp, a long-time corporate financier in the biotech sector. Megan is Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of Opthea since 2014. Megan has over 20 years of experience focusing on angiogenesis and therapeutic strategies for cancer and ophthalmic indications. Megan has held various positions, including the head of preclinical R&D and CEO of Opthea, which at that time operated as a 100% owned subsidiary of Circadian, developing OPT-302 for the development of wet age-related macular degeneration. Prior to Opthea, Megan was employed at Genentech, a leader in angiogenesis-based therapies for cancer and other diseases. Her experience included several years as a researcher before moving to Genentech's commercial division and having responsibility for corporate competitive intelligence activities. In these roles, she developed extensive commercial and scientific knowledge in anti-angiogenic and oncology drug development. She holds a PhD in medicine from University of Melbourne, having conducted her doctoral studies at the Ludwig Institute for Cancer Research. Megan is on the board of Oz Biotech and is a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Danny Sharp, not been on this forum before. Thanks, Danny, for joining us. He is one of the most experienced biotech fundraisers in the Australian market. For over 20 years, Danny headed the healthcare and life science corporate finance divisions at leading Australian firms, most recently at Canaccord Genuity, where he was an executive director of corporate finance from 2012 to 2020. Danny has advised and continues to advise many of the ASX's most successful emerging and mid-cap companies on IPOs and capital raisings across the life sciences, technologies, financial services, and general industrial sectors. Given you've got it spread there, Danny, it'll be good to get any differences between life sciences and other sectors. Sure. He is a non-executive director of Alcidion Group Limited. Today, we'll be discussing Opthea's commercialisation progress and biotech capital raising and the changing environment of doing an IPO on the ASX. So to the audience, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen anytime, and we'll address as many of these as possible after we answer the pre-submitted questions. First, Matt on the Horizon, where I comment on some of the important developments locally and internationally impacting our sector and thus investment objectives. In local news, Imugene says it will work with Eureka Therapeutics to evaluate combining its CD19 oncolytic virus technology with Eureka's Artemis T-cell therapy in solid tumours. Imugene said the partnership with the California-based Eureka would aim to establish a mark and kill process to which its CD19 oncolytic virus technology would force tumours to express CD19, which could then be targeted by Eureka's anti-CD19 Artemis T-cell therapies, all not to be confused with COVID-19. Telix says the TGA has granted the first approval for its Illuccix, apologies for the pronunciation if I get that wrong, Illuccix for diagnostic imaging of men with prostate cancer. Telix said the TGA had granted a broad clinical indication, including patients at risk of metastases suitable for initial definitive therapy or primary staging, as well as patients suspected of recurring prostate cancer based on elevated antigen serum levels, also known as biochemical recurrence. Cynata Therapeutics has renegotiated the rights to its graft versus host disease program that was licensed to Fujifilm Corporation in Japan. Under the new arrangement, Cynata has regained all commercialization rights to the program, with Fujifilm expected to take on manufacturing of the company's stem cell therapies in Japan. Fujifilm will pay Cynata $5 million under the terms of the original agreement, presumably for ceasing commercial development of the program. And in international news, the FDA added new restrictions to all breast implants on the market for years, after years of chasing cases of rare cancers and reports of a constellation of symptoms that can include fatigue, memory loss, confusion, rashes, and joint pain. The agency curbed the sale and distribution of both saline and silicone gel-filled breast implants, including products from Allergan, Johnson & Johnson's Mentor divisions, Scientra, and Ideal Implant, by restricting them only to providers who walk prospective patients through a decision checklist outlining the long-term risks and obtain their signature before the operation. And finally, as many of you know, the founder and editor of BioShares, David Blake, was diagnosed with brain and lung cancer. Andrew Geddes established a GoFundMe page to support David, his wife and daughter. The response has been better than David and his family could have expected. So a big thank you to all those that contributed. And we wish David well going forward. Now, to our panelists. Megan, can I start with you, please? For just over a year now, you've been dual listed on ASX and NASDAQ. What learnings, pros and cons could you impart on other ASX listed companies considering such market strategy?
Yeah, so look, we listed on the NASDAQ towards the end of 2020. So we've been listed now, I think it's almost to a week, 12 months. And that was a really successful financing. We raised, as you might recall, about 180 million Australian dollars, about 128 million US dollars. And that's a very large liquid capital. And that was necessary given that we have a very late stage clinical development program and we're really going for global approval. And so we need to conduct a sizable phase 3 clinical trial program. So it was important for us, I think, to access the capital markets in the United States. We found that listing on the NASDAQ gave us access to more US investors. It enabled greater participation from international investors who see the familiarity or may prefer to invest on the NASDAQ. And we certainly saw that in our experience with our financing. But I think that's really focused on, how we executed that current financing. I think being on the NASDAQ has also enabled us to grow our profile internationally, and I expect that to continue over time. We're building out our US team, and we're really positioning the company to be close to not only our shareholders, but operationally to have greater access to the US markets, the clinicians in the United States, and to really start positioning the company around a commercialization strategy that will initially be focused on the US and then will expand into the rest of the world. So being listed on the NASDAQ, being recognised as a US company as well as an Australian listed company is something that, we've really had a long-term strategy, and we ensured that we did that at the right time. And for us, that was aligning with moving forward into late-stage clinical development. So I think the timing was right, and it sets us up now as we prepare for commercialization. I think some of the challenges that go with that, obviously, you need to manage 2 exchanges. It's not going to surprise anyone for me to say, there's a lot of governance and a lot of reporting requirements that come about being listed on the NASDAQ, a lot of accounting standards and internal control procedures that you need to implement. So it becomes quite a closely managed kind of company from a reporting and internal kind of operational viewpoint. But the upside to that is, of course, that you're operating in the US and you can be seen as a US company, but not only by the investors there, but also by other companies in the space. And so you're kind of operating in the same sandpit, if you will. But that governance and the reporting requirements is a step above what we've needed to do on the ASX in the past. And so I would say that that's sort of one of the really big changes. I think it's challenging at this current environment, and hopefully we're coming out of it now, but it's been challenging over the last 12 to 18 months to really get on the ground and interact face-to-face with our investors. But certainly as we look forward, we'll be able to do that in a much more interactive way, particularly on the ground in the United States. And I think that's something that we'll really start to see the benefits of as well.
Great, thank you. And after that successful capital raise, I'm going to assume your capital position is still very healthy. What's the company's focus over the coming 12 to 24 months, and what milestones do you aim to deliver in that timeline?
Yeah, so as listeners are probably aware, we have 2 phase 3 clinical trials that are ongoing right now. They're quite large studies of almost 1,000 patients each. And we've deliberately undertaken them of that size and magnitude in order to satisfy, both from a statistical perspective and demonstrating outcomes for our patients, but also so that those trials are recognised globally, so that we can really go for gold and go for the largest commercial opportunity and really maximise the opportunity for this asset, OPT302. So we are really laser focused on delivering the outcomes of those phase 3s. We expect to report out the phase 3 top line data, which is the data package that we anticipate submitting for approval in the United States, but also with other regulators around the world. We anticipate reporting that data out towards the end of 2023. So right now, what we're actively doing, and in terms of milestones for the company, is really ramping up opening clinical trial sites in various countries around the world, which involves a lot of ethics and regulatory interactions and a lot of logistical operational activities as well. And I would say to investors out there, really look for our updates around the progress with our patient recruitment. We anticipate to be recruiting into 2022. Obviously, it's about an 18-month recruitment period, and that sets us up for the readout from the 12-month dosing point towards the end of 2023. And that's a really critical milestone for the company, that readout of the clinical trial, because it is a late stage program, and that is the data that we need actually to take us to launch and for commercialization. And that's really what all biotech companies are really aiming to do, right? To bring a drug to market. And unfortunately, there's many Australian companies that have not achieved that, or don't necessarily have that global aim. That's certainly what we're looking to achieve at Opthea. In addition to that, though, the company really wants to maximise the opportunity for the molecule. So we're looking at other geographical regions, perhaps where we don't have the resources, where we haven't focused our time and effort to date, countries like Japan and China, for example, where in the long term, we can see the opportunity to really maximise those markets as well. And there's lots of opportunities to either do that through partnerships or to ramp up our activities as our own company in those different regions. So we're looking from a broader strategic perspective as well, around building out our programs for OPT302 and to bring that drug as an accessible drug to patients all around the world. And there's multiple ways that we can go about that, whether or not that's building up our own internal capabilities, but also being open to discussions with third parties to ensure that that can happen.
Great. Okay, thank you. And I'm sure you get this question on a regular basis, but Horizon 3 Biotech Fund has recently invested in a company, the US company called Lumathera, the medical device company using photobiomodulation to treat dry AMD. Can you explain the difference between dry and wet AMD, and might there be any synergy from one successful AMD treatment also treating the other AMD?
Yeah, so there are essentially 2 basic forms of macular degeneration. One is dry AMD and the other one is wet AMD. And obviously, as Opthea, we're focused on the wet form. And actually, that's the form of the disease that is later stage, but is the form that is associated with very severe and often very rapid vision loss. Dry AMD, on the other hand, accounts for about 85% of all of the macular degeneration. It's a much slower form of macular degeneration that is not always, and in fact, in the majority of cases, not always associated with vision loss, because it does happen very early in the disease process. And it may, in the long run, culminate in some blurred vision and some loss of vision. But for the most part, dry AMD can go unsymptomatic. As such, it's therefore poorly diagnosed. Patients can have dry AMD, but not necessarily get treated for it until it can then convert over into the wet form. But dry AMD, there's currently no approved therapies for it. It's a form of macular degeneration that often is slow. It may involve some deposits at the back of the eye, which ultimately can then progress into more significant issues with vision. But it's really at the point where dry AMD converts into wet AMD that the current therapies that are approved for macular degeneration start to have utility. And that's because that conversion from dry to wet is when the vessels start to grow and where there's a lot of fluid and leakage at the back of the eye that contributes to the very rapid vision loss. Our current standard of care treatments actually target those processes as opposed to targeting the earlier forms of dry AMD. And it's interesting to hear of the company that you're talking about there, really looking at those earlier mechanisms to prevent then the progression into the more severe form. So there's synergies, I think, in the perspective of we're all in this trying to prevent vision loss for patients. I think the challenge for companies in dry AMD is it's been a very difficult space to get drugs approved. I think sometimes that is related to the fact that it often goes undiagnosed and it is a slower, more indolent kind of progression of disease. But it's certainly a very large market if you can find the right mechanism to target.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. And Megan, what have you told the market about plans to commercialise your product? You touched on it before. I think you said, no definitive decisions been made, but what will help you decide whether you're going to license it out or take it all the way to the market?
Yeah, and we're really ramping up our plans around commercialisation strategy right now. And I think the best position that a biotech company can be in is to position the company for either partnerships so that you can leverage the resources, experience, and the footprint of large companies that are based around the world. But it's also equally important to not rely on those mechanisms and to ensure that you can build a commercial infrastructure internally that enables you to take a company through your product through launch and then into a revenue generating product. So that's what we're looking at right now. As a small company, we are growing. We're going to be growing our commercial team, and that will be a relevant team regardless if we stay alone and independent or if we were to partner with a larger pharmaceutical company that's already got drugs on the market, for example. You do need commercial folk in your management team in order to give it the best chance for a successful launch. So as a company, we're open to both strategies. What will dictate that will really depend on, what any kind of relationship looks like, whether or not that's deemed to be, something that is complementary to our existing capabilities or capabilities that we're developing, and whether or not it really expands the commercial opportunity for the product. And all of those things weigh into any decision, I think, when you're looking to really maximise opportunities for what you have in-house.
Okay, thank you. And Danny, just sort of to introduce yourself to the audience that don't already know you, what was your career path that you ended up at the leading edge of financing the biotech sector? Because you've been in the sector now for 22 years.
About 173 years, Matt. Since about the year 2000, I entered the sector. So a serendipitous sort of career path to end up where in biotech. I was a litigation lawyer for the first 7 years of my career, and I got poached by a private investment bank to do some structured finance work because someone told them I was a lawyer that understood numbers. So I did that for about 3 years. And then I got the offer out of the blue to head up corporate finance at one of the institutional brokers, small ones. And that broker was very dominant in small and mid-cap space. And as it happened, my very first transaction that I worked on was a company called Celestis, which was a diagnostic for TB. I have to admit, Matt, I knew absolutely nothing about biotech. I actually had never run a public company transaction before, so I knew nothing about the public markets. So I was very, very, very green and very lucky. Celestis turned out to be one of the truly major success stories of Australian biotech. I don't know if how many of your audience are old enough to remember it, but it floated at 20 cents a share pre-revenue in 2000. And by 2009, it was the gold standard for tuberculosis testing in the world, and taken out for several $100 million with, I think it was approaching 100 million revenues per annum at that stage, taken out by a major European company, Infusion. So I was very lucky. But what I did learn through that process, in all seriousness, Matt, is I have a curious mind. So I actually spent a lot of time getting to know the science, understand the science, get to know the scientists and get to know the scientists around the scientists, asking questions about the technology. And I really enjoyed the process of coming to learn about it. So I just applied that same process to all the subsequent opportunities that came in, and started to develop a knowledge and love for the sector.
Oh, that's great. Good. I'm glad you landed on our sector. So what have your observations been with respect to capital raisings in the Australian biotech sector during the pandemic compared to pre-pandemic?
Yeah, I suppose I'd divide that to the really initial pandemic stage. I think raising for anything was difficult in that first 3 months or so of the pandemic. Just everyone was in fear, and it was difficult to raise money for anything. I know I was raising money for a company. I think we're in trading halt for 7 days, just trying to scrounge together a few pennies, and for quite a successful company. Once the easing, monetary and fiscal easing came in, really the environment became very strong. When governments do start to provide liquidity into markets in a low interest rate environment, then risk assets and growth assets become highly attractive, and there is a lot of money around, and that's, I think, really eased the conditions for biotech raisings, not only in Australia but worldwide. I hopefully see that continuing still for a period of time still. So I think pandemic in the end has been quite good for the sector's ability to raise money.
Oh, great. Okay. And word on the street is that during 2021, the ASX has been clamping down on earlier stage biotech companies, probably pre-revenue, but from being allowed to IPO. Is this consistent with your observations? And assuming it is true, do you think it's a good or a bad thing for our sector?
Yeah, and just before I answer that, actually, Megan, did you raise money before and during the pandemic? I was just curious whether your experience was similar.
We listed on the NASDAQ during the pandemic. So we did it all virtually here from Australia, and actually all the US companies that listed on the NASDAQ were also doing it virtually. So I guess from that perspective, everyone was on an even level playing field in that regard. There was just a lot of very, very late night and overnight time zone changes, even though I was living here in Melbourne.
It's actually a really good point, because one thing I should add, Megan's raised a really good point there. The actual logistics of raising capital post-pandemic has been marvellously easier for the sector in terms of just that simple thing of having a roadshow. So roadshowing to investors used to be for companies and bankers a 5-day event, multiple aeroplanes, and hopefully you'd get across 40, 50 institutions through the course of that roadshow across 4 or 5 geographies. Roadshows now are a 1-day event, 2-day event at most, done out of your living room, all over, and to investors all over the world. It is so efficient, and you can typically get in 1 or 2 days, maybe to 200 institutions or something like that through groups, and doing it half hour apart instead of an hour apart plus walking distance. So incredible efficiencies have come out of the use of Zoom and other parts in terms of capital raising.
Yeah, I think for a long time now we're going to be saying, what do we miss about the lockdowns? And like you've just been a good example there, and my one is traffic. I'm hating the traffic already.
Yeah.
Danny, recently you joined the board of Alcidion. Given your in-depth knowledge of this sector, can you tell us what drew you to Alcidion?
Yeah, a couple of things, Matt. So I have to admit, my first introduction to Alcidion was through one of its board members, actually its chairman, who I know well, and I respect her a lot. We've worked together a lot in the sector over many, many years. So she was the first person to tell me about the company a number of years ago when she joined the board of Alcidion. And I had a look into it, and I bought a parcel of shares myself, both because I liked the story and to help back her and the company. And then I've watched the company for, I suppose, a good 3 years or so, and watched the incredible developments of the company through that time. So for those who don't know, Alcidion is a software company, hospital administration systems, covering all facets of the hospital's operations. It could be patient tracking, it could be tracking of medications, it could be efficiency of hospital beds or surgical rooms. And what you find in the hospital systems is that the market is proliferated by modules that actually are separate. They'll have one system for patient tracking, another system for hospital beds, another system to track medication, and none of them have been built to talk to each other. So our Alcidion system, first of all, it has its own modules in each of those various plethora of things that are important to hospitals, and they're built on open architecture. So they enable all the various tools being used by hospitals to speak to each other for the very first time. And as well as that, within its system, it then incorporates a lot of artificial intelligence, AI, to actually start making the jobs of hospitals, nurses, doctors easier by recognizing, well, if this has happened in the patient tracking, then we need this to happen in the scheduling of a surgical room. Whereas previously the two systems wouldn't be talking to each other. So in the day and age where efficiency in hospitals are under such pressure, first of all, just because of the flow of patients, they're under pressure because of the move from to a lot of telemedicine type of medicine. So the ability to monitor and treat patients remotely and to coordinate with that. Information systems that both create efficiency and enable various systems to talk to each other, incredibly important, and that's why Alcidion's been so successful both here and overseas.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
And apart from Opthea, obviously, and Alcidion, obviously, can you give the audience a couple of companies that you currently like that they might look further into?
I thought they were the only two good ones in the market, Matt. But, I should say, there's one that I absolutely kicked myself because I think, Megan, I first met you when you were looking at floating many, many years ago, and I actually really liked your company back then, but it didn't get the float, and I wish I had. And it's been a fantastic success story, yeah. Yeah.
It was a long time ago when it floated, but yeah, you probably met me when we were a very different company back then, very, very early stage, and we've certainly taken it a long way since that point.
Yeah, congratulations. It's been a terrific journey. So, and I do really like Opthea as a company. It's got such incredible prospects in front of it and come such a long way. Look, probably the way I usually answer the question, Matt, is to say, well, what am I holding in my own portfolio? Or what's the highest weightings of holdings in my own portfolio? And I don't only hold biotech shares, but probably the three that I hold most. One is Telix. I think I love matching in my assessment of companies the science, the quality of management, getting to know management personally, and also finding out what other practitioners, what do the doctors say about the technology. And Telix, I came to know Chris a number of years ago. He was a very controversial character, Chris Barenbush, when he first started, because he's very controversial in his journalistic approach prior to becoming CEO of Telix. But incredibly smart and driven guy, and very good science, and actually a very decent human being. I came to know Chris we're not friends, but I came to know him in context outside of work, and just a very, very decent human being. And then on the flip side, I do have a lot of friends who are cancer doctors, and without me asking them about Telix, I started being asked questions, actually. Have I heard of a company called Telix? They're doing some great things, and some of their trial work's outstanding. And that's what had me starting to buy shares in the first place a number of years ago. And they're just seemingly going from strength to strength. I noticed you mentioned the announcement they put out the other day. So certainly Telix, I think, is a great success story and got a lot still to go in front of it. My other two probably largest holdings, and I have to admit I'm the banker for both these companies, so there's a bit of blowing sort of my own wind.
Self-promotion, that's okay.
Yeah. So apologies for that, but I love Nanosonics. Nanosonics, in a way similar to the Celestis story, it has it has got itself to a position where it is the global gold standard in disinfection for ultrasound probes. It's an area where there's a huge need. Practitioners used to take ultrasound probes that have been in vaginas or down gullets and just wipe it with a tissue and then use it on the next patient. And the infection transfer that happened in hospitals and still does happen in hospitals was extraordinary. And if they didn't do that, then they used to take the ultrasound probes, have to build a special room out the back with really poisonous chemicals in it, have people gowned up and dip the probes in buckets of poisonous chemicals. Nanosonics has a little unit that sits actually in the practitioner's room. It kind of looks like a little bit like a little dishwasher. The ultrasound probe goes in, you press the button, and in 6 minutes, it's fully decontaminated through a cycle. It's incredible technology being adopted all around the world. They're also now approaching 100 million of revenue, I think, or close enough to, somewhere between 50 and 100, can't remember the number. And again, those second and third limbs, very, very decent management, both at a personal and professional level, and very, very strong feedback from the hospitals that use the technology. So they're, again, there might be $5, $6 a share now, but they're early in their journey in terms of capturing markets, and also that they always talk about their next product and the next product that is still to come out. So lots are still going Nanosonics. And then the third one is ImpediMed, which is a bit smaller than the other two. It is a love child of mine. I think they're just in extraordinary shape now. So we actually did a raising for them last week. But ImpediMed's got an incredible technology for being able to absolutely map down to the milliliter, the water, muscle, and effectively composition of your body, and where that water or muscle might be at. So that's very important in things like cancer patients developing lymphedema. The earlier you can find a change in the water levels in certain parts of the body, the earlier you can start predicting and therefore treating medications. A patient's going to develop lymphedema. It's also important for heart failure patients. The earlier you can pick up a change in water level on the lungs, the earlier you can change the diuretics. Otherwise, that heart failure patient's going to end up back in hospital in emergency and probably ICU. It's also very important in dialysis, because dialysis is all about getting the fluid balance of your body right, because your kidneys aren't doing it, and to be able to precisely down to milliliters measure the fluid within the body is vital. So ImpediMed's doing about $10 million worth now of sales. It's a SaaS model, which is great. Doing about $10 million of sales. Interestingly, the thing about their sales is that the hospitals that adopt their technology at the moment don't get paid for it. So they cost them to buy it from ImpediMed, and they can't charge anyone for it because of there's no private pay coverage. ImpediMed just now published its 5-year 1,200 patient study. Fantastic results. It will enable them to go to the private payers, should enable them to get coverage, and the sales that should come from that when hospitals actually get paid to use the technology rather than costing them to use technology should be quite extraordinary. And they're now very well funded as well. They have $50 million plus in the bank. So I think they've got a great future ahead.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for that. It's very unusual to have a successful very unusual to have a successful company without reimbursement. But sounds like the worm's about to turn for them.
Yeah.
So we're going to had a couple of questions from the audience. Please use your Q&A button on your Zoom screen to submit your questions. We've had one pre-submitted question, but I believe Megan's already answered this. They asked for Megan's reflections on NASDAQ listing debate. I think we've covered that. But there have been a couple of other questions, which I'll just pull up. Megan, why 2 phase 3s?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's pretty standard across most indications that you do need to do 2 phase 3s. You could really think about it as one being confirmatory of the other. It's a regulatory requirement generally, unless you're in an orphan disease or a very small indication where it's very difficult to get patients. Essentially, the regulators around the world want you to run 2 independent phase 3 clinical trials, because from a statistical perspective, there's more power in doing that, and you can be more certain of the results, and you can confirm with the outcomes of one to the other. And so that's typically what is required for the approval of most large kind of, blockbuster kind of agents. Even any therapy that's going to go through a standard regulatory process will need to do those 2 phase 3s from a regulatory perspective.
Okay, thank you. And Sanjay asked, will the product be required prescription to get it? And,
yeah, it will be covered by, it's a drug that will be administered by a retinal specialist. It's an injection into the eye, and we anticipate having negotiations with payers and reimbursement of that therapy, but it is a prescription in that sense, that it'll be covered through insurers, but also through your healthcare provider, so that there is a script involved. It's not over the counter.
Yep. Okay. Thank you. And this next question is from Ross, and it's to both of you to possibly comment. It's a bit of a long one. We can talk about completing successful capital raisings in the US, but a quick glance at the share price charts for most Aussie biotechs that have undertaken full F1 NASDAQ listing in the US would show a very different perspective on the term successful in the eyes of shareholders, given substantial share price depreciation post-listing. Any comments from Megan or Danny on this observation?
Well, I think from our perspective, very successful means that we've got the program run and we're up and running, and we've successfully managed to finance it. If you look at share price for any company, including even companies in Australia, and I'm sure Ross can understand that from the company he's running as well, there's a snapshot in time with respect to share price. It's often dictated by things that don't necessarily reflect the success of the company or the progress of the company, but it's really just perhaps a matter of timeline before you're having your catalyst, and really just a matter of getting out and in front of investors. So I would see that as a snapshot in time, and wouldn't necessarily judge the success of a successful financing or listing on the NASDAQ through, fluctuations in share price, not necessarily.
You got anything to add there, Danny?
Yeah, the view I have with the NASDAQ listing, there's all sorts of reasons why listed companies in Australia may look to NASDAQ for raising, and some of them are good reasons, some of them are not good reasons. I think Opthea is a great example of a positive reason to list on NASDAQ. It's a growing company, and the NASDAQ listing does allow it to truly access larger global markets as it moves forward. It also allows the company to be closer to the potential M&A partners or the potential commercial partners that they will look to use down the track. So that's a good reason. I know from experience there are plenty of companies that have listed on NASDAQ because they've run out of raising opportunities in Australia. They've just exhausted the market here. That's a bad reason, right? So that's not a reason to go. And then the third aspect of it, I think like any market, once you move into a stock, whether you list in Australia or you list on NASDAQ, once you make that decision to do it, then you've got to service the market you're moving to, because share prices don't just take care of themselves. The company has to have a presence in the market that it's listed through, investor communications, through roadshows with institutions, etc., to maintain a profile in those markets. So it's a very hard thing to do from Australia when because we're so far away. Some companies do it better than others, and I think it's a very important part. But over time, good companies going to a bigger market for more capital and bigger partners, it will be a good move for those companies over time if they've gone there for the right reasons.
Yeah, I would have to concur there. From an N of one that I've been involved in, Vita Medical, that was a very successful flip to the US. And as you said, it involves having a presence there, not being here. But there are some successes, and I'm sure there are some others that aren't so successful. Danny, just touching on the earlier question, which I'm not sure you really went into much, but there has been much IPO activity in the biotech sector. And this question is, how long might we expect this IPO window to remain open? And maybe you can also just comment on whether you are seeing companies knocked back by the ASX.
Yeah, So you mentioned that ASX. Sorry, I forgot to answer the question. So
That's all right.
Look, I'm seeing it not only in the biotech sector, but in all sectors. The ASX seems to be increasingly proactive in what it views as its need to protect retail investors who are ever present and growing presence in our market, and therefore prone to prone to be taken advantage of. I just don't know that ASX is doing it in the right way, to be honest. We see it with company announcements, for example. There's also a lot of pressure on companies. They want to put out an announcement and they're stuck in pause for ages while the ASX reviews and considers whether they think the announcement's appropriate and asks for changes, etc. I don't think that's the role of the ASX. And I don't think the ASX has the expertise. So, for example, in biotech, they might, to say we just don't think it's suitable for the market because it's too early stage. Well, those of us who operate in the sector know you can have a terrific early stage investment opportunity and you can have a lousy late stage investment opportunity. So it's such an arbitrary and incorrect measure. That to me demonstrates that things are being applied the wrong way. I do think retail investors need additional protection. Just the ease of accessing a product like IPOs and the ease for IPO runners to find retail investors is a dangerous thing without enough protections in there. But I think it should come through much clearer and much fuller risk disclosures rather than the ASX determining by some arbitrary measures whether they think a company is suitable to float. In the end, we are all risk investors. If we understand the risk, then we choose to invest. It's when you don't understand the risk that the problems arise. So that's on the ASX side. I think they're right with their intention, just wrong with the tool. I don't think it's good for the biotech sector or any sector. I think more oversight and more risk disclosure would be good for the biotech sector or any sector. In terms of the second part of the question, Matt, was it, am I seeing more IPOs?
No, how long do we expect the IPO window to remain open?
Yeah. I'm not a great believer in windows, actually. I find closing of windows are very temporary. So, and I find even in what people call closed windows, good IPOs get done. And in fact, they're generally great opportunities for investors because they get done in tougher conditions and therefore the pricing is usually better. So I remember, Celestis got done in 2000, just after it got done in 2001, actually. Just after the tech wreck of 2000, and I think it was the first IPO for 4 months in the whole of Australia. They just got done at a good price for investors to get done. So I'm not a great believer in windows. I think previously, our sector was more exposed to downturn in broad investor sentiment just because there was less expertise in the Australian market to assess, like proper technical expertise. Institutions didn't have their biotech specialists. There wasn't enough biotech product around the market for investors to invest into experts to help them guide them through it. I think now the sector's a whole lot more mature. A lot of funds have very smart people to assess biotech opportunities like they do every other opportunity. So I think that we'll be less prone to effects of windows, and therefore I think the sector's in good shape moving forward for a long time to come.
Thanks for that. Look, we're going to have to wind it up now, and the next webinar will be back on a Thursday, the 2nd of December at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Thank you to the audience. Your feedback and suggestions are most welcome. Our thanks to FB Rice and Monsoon Communications for sponsoring and hosting this webinar. And finally, thank you again to Megan and Danny for joining us. See you all again soon. And on behalf of Horizon 3 Biotech team, goodbye for now and good investing. Thank you, guys. Much appreciated.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Enjoy.